Okay, here we go. Hi, everyone. My name is Amherst Williams. I'm the Executive Director of the Connecticut League of History Organizations, and I want to welcome you here today for our long anticipated workshop on interpreting slavery at Connecticut museums and historic sites. This workshop was originally slated to happen on March 30th, 2020, and we all know how that went. So I'm very pleased that we are able to offer this as a two-part Zoom program. Part two will be offered in this time slot next Friday, and you're welcome to join us for that as well. We have a great list of presenters here today. We're going to share a bit about the work that they have been doing on these fronts, but our intent with this workshop, which perhaps is even more relevant now than it was back in March. I don't know if that could possibly be true, but it's certainly at the forefront of everybody's minds, given what has happened over the course of the last year. So we're very pleased to offer this program, and our intent is really to make this a conversation and have those of you who are participating be able to come away with some ideas for your own sites, what you can do to start incorporating more hidden histories and more untold histories of this sort at your own organizations. So with that in mind, I'll give you a little overview of what we're going to do today. We have with us here today Dr. Dan J. Broyld, who teaches in the history department at Central Connecticut State University, where CLHO's main office is normally housed under, normal working conditions. Dan's office is normally right next to mine, but now we're next to each other on these in the Brady Bunch Zoom rectangles. So he'll be giving us some introductory remarks to help contextualize what our presenters are going to be talking about. We also have with us Ramin Ganeshram from the Westport Museum for History and Culture, and she's going to be talking about researching local histories of slavery for an exhibition that they mounted recently. After her presentation, we're going to have about 10 minutes of breakout rooms. I'm going to shuttle you all to breakout rooms. It's very straightforward. If you haven't done this in Zoom, you just say, yes, send me to the breakout room, and you'll be able to talk in smaller groups about how you might implement these sorts of ideas at your own site. What are you doing? What ideas do you have based on the presentation? These are not moderated little discussions. It's just an opportunity for you to talk amongst yourselves with other attendees of the workshop and start thinking about how you can implement these ideas in your own context. Next, we'll have Melissa Houston from Keeler Tavern Museum talking about shifting interpretation in museum education programs. And again, we'll go into some breakout sessions after her presentation before coming back to kind of wrap up as a group and share some of the things that you guys have been thinking about and also share some resources. I have a resource list that Beth Rose, our CLHO board president, who actually organized this program but couldn't be here today, put together with some of our presenters. So I'll share a link to that Google Doc in the chat as well. But without further ado, I'd just like to hand things over to Dan to get things started. Dan, take it away.
All right, cheers. How's everyone doing? I know you guys can't respond because you're all on mute, but nonetheless, I just wanted to give some context for examining slavery in Connecticut. And I think that this is, good context. I'm a historian of slavery, but I'm far more interested in resistance and emancipation, right? And so I find that these four, forms of resistance that I'll list from, least threatening to most threatening really helps to give context for the fact that slaves were always constantly resisting. The first form of resistance, which was the most widespread and hostile towards slavery, was the day-to-day silent sabotage or hidden transcript of resistance, doing poor work, breaking tools, abusing animals, theft of food, pretending to be ill, overall disrupting the work or plantation routine and causing low productivity. Always tell my students that if you're not doing this at work, you're not working, because if you have ever called out of work and you're not sick, but you really want to go to a concert, or your friends come into a coffee shop, you work at the coffee shop and you slip them an extra coffee, or you work at Dunkin' Donuts, or you take pizza home at night, this is the hidden transcript of resistance, right? And so, when your manager is away, right, the workers will play, right? And the same thing with enslaved people, nobody's totally compliant, right? And so we have to understand that just beneath the surface, and this is what, people will say about American workers are not resisting. I would argue that they are through these hidden transcripts of resistance. I would argue that they are resisting. And so just to give a little context to this is that the hidden transcript of resistance is a term that is used by scholars to characterize the behavior performed by the subordinate groups off stage or concealed from direct observation of the power holder. The hidden transcript implies that resistance lies discreetly and strategically beneath the surface from the conventional public dimension. Now, what is the public dimension? The public dimension underscores the open and formal public interaction between the dominant and the oppressed, in which the subordinate is casted as submissive. So this is, your boss is around. Yes, I'm going to do that right away. I always take a 30-minute break. And then when the boss is away, what do you do? You're taking 40 minutes, right? You're not doing what you're supposed to do. And so this is what slaves are constantly involved in. And this is what I would argue the American worker is constantly involved in as well, is this hidden transcript of resistance, especially with you guys working from home now. What are you really doing? Right. And so usually when I teach classes, I ask my students to volunteer, some of the ways that they, use the hidden transcript of resistance at work. And it's always kind of funny. And, I'm like, I'm not going to call your supervisor. Right. And me as a professor, yeah, I let class out early, sometimes, right? I may take some staples, home from work, right? And so that's all, you're not supposed to be doing that, right? And so slaves are constantly doing that. And so they're in a constant form of rebellion. The second form, less frequent but more dangerous, are serious crimes committed by slaves. The most important thing to understand about this is it's one-on-one or one on few. So arson, poisoning, somebody works in the kitchen and they slip master a Mickey and he doesn't wake up the next day, right? Or you do something to the family. Armed assault, you see this with Frederick Douglass where he beats Edward Covey up, right? And so it doesn't help the entire body of the enslaved, right? But it works on a kind of one-to-one to one-to-few basis, right? And so this would be like, you winning a lawsuit against your particular company that you work through or work for, right? Or I'm slipping down the stairs at CCSU and I sue them because I slipped down the stairs. It helps me. It doesn't help every CCSU worker, right, where I work at, right? Or, these are class action suits. I remember my father had one when he worked for Kodak Camera back in Rochester, where African Americans were underpaid, so they had a class action suit. And so it helped African Americans. It didn't help the body of workers that work for Kodak. But this is what we always look for when we think about resistance, the outright rebellions. And two, people always say, if I was a slave, I would have revolted. And you have to understand they're in a constant state of rebellion, right? And so generally, this is what we look for when we say if somebody's like in rebellion, especially too with like the American workers, we look for pickets and sit-ins and stuff like, but you don't really get that, right? All the time, right? You may get it at moments. And so everybody really looks for these kind of major moments, right? Like the Amistad, like Gamal Prasser, who planned the insurrection and it was suppressed. Denmark Vesey's really interesting. He wins the lotto in Haiti and then moves to South Carolina and plans an insurrection. If I win the lotto, if I hit the Powerball, I'll be in the South of France. I don't know. This guy starts, a revolt. And then Nat Turner, we know, a successful slave insurrection. But this is what we generally look for, when we think about insurrection or worker revolt. And this remains true today, right? When we think about workers resisting, we're looking for those kind of major moments, right? But those major moments don't always come. Plus, everybody that is involved in those major moments, they all die. They all get hung. And so that's why the hidden transcript is so important because you have to keep your job. Like, my father would bring things home from work, but he could only take so much because he has to keep his job to take care of his family, right? And slaves, they're trying to stay alive. So the hidden transcript becomes very important. I would argue that the most dangerous, form of resistance to slavery is the runaway. The self-stolen property. You don't even own yourself. You stole yourself. Like, how does that work, right? And so And so the runaway is the nuisance of slave holding, right? It's like the dust, right? You know, you can have a beautiful museum. What gets in? The dust, right? You can't always keep an eye on Jimmy the Black Slave. Like, you know what I mean? Unless you have GPS tracking, you're not keeping, you know, you own 20 slaves, good luck, right? The other thing is that it inspires other slaves. They praise, you know, every day, every week, every month that a slave has gotten away, you know, they're celebrating that, right? But I think that the most important thing to really understand is the day-to-day hidden transcript of resistance when we're talking about slavery. And you know, every time we talk about slavery, we have to talk about resistance. And so I just wanted to kind of provide this context, so when we're talking about slavery, we can kind of think through, you know, the hidden transcript of resistance, the less frequent but more dangerous one-to-one to one-to-few things, the mass rebellions, but also the runaways as well.
Thank you so much, Dan. It's great to see a little Jim Scott, Connecticut resident, by the way, lives down in Durham, dropped into our presentation here.
Yeah, the other thing is, if you read, you know, if you read Venture Smith, you know, James Mars, Pennington, you can start to see those hidden transcript moments, right, in their narratives.
Yeah, and we have a great comment from Tracy about infanticide as another troubling form of resistance, also documented as well. Thank you so much, Dan. I'm going to hand things over to Ramin now. Ramin Ganeshram at the Westport Museum for History and Culture is going to share a little bit about her experiences researching local histories of slavery for an exhibition they did at Westport on the history of African Americans in that town. Ramin, take it away.
Yeah, I'm going to share my screen. Let's hope that this works. Okay, hold on. Let's see. All right. And you guys can see that all right, I hope?
Yes.
Okay. So at Westport Museum, formerly Westport Historical Society, in 2018, we did an exhibit called, remember, The History of African Americans in Westport. And this exhibit was very much based, actually, on some level, common sense. And what do I mean by that? I mean by that an understanding of the fact that certainly Westport was a place where slavery must have had existed by virtue of the fact of the kind of place it was. So something that's often said in Westport is that Westport is not currently diverse because it was never diverse, and that's actually not true. From the 17th century, 7,500 years prior to European colonizers settling what is called Green's Farms, a core part of the town, there were native Paugussett people. And then those colonizers enslaved Africans to work on the farms here in Westport and on the docks and in the shipping areas and various manufactories. So there was always a diverse aspect to the town because of these economic facts. So starting from that place of common sense was really where we started to do our research. So one of the first things I say when we talk about researching slavery is this: dive into the demographics. You have to think about the place that you're talking about. Was it farming? Was it manufacturing, shipping? Was there a population boom? And when did that happen? Did that happen in the colonial era? Did it happen, let's say in the 1840s at a time in Connecticut, because of gradual abolition, slavery in Connecticut was very much almost over. You have to really think about this. How close is your town or your area that you're looking at to a commercial hub? Obviously, since slavery was a socioeconomic transaction, the purpose was for wealth and profit and economy. That's important. If you're talking about an extremely rural area with some, sort of middling, if you will, farmers, the likelihood of widespread slavery is going to be less. It's not to say it will be necessarily non-existent, but it will be less. Same thing with strategic military hubs. Why? Because then, as now, when you had a fort, you had a military base, you had a port where you had a lot of troops or militia, you had a need for goods. And those goods were provided by locals who were obviously, trying to make a profit and therefore might very likely have had enslaved people, working for them. So that's, location matters. Location matters also in terms of, really thinking about where to get your records. So once you can figure out where your area sits, you're going to start to, that's going to give you a clue as to not only the nature of potential slavery, but where to find the material that you need. So I'll give you an example here in Westport. The town of Westport wasn't incorporated until 1835. But what is the town of Westport was settled by Europeans from 1648. So that means for us that our records, when we were researching this exhibit, and again, taking into account that gradual abolition was 1784 to 1848, 1835 being, more to the tail end of gradual abolition, it means that our records relating to slavery in what is today the town of Westport are not in Westport. They're in the town of Fairfield or they're in the town of Norwalk. So that's something that you also have to really consider before we started our research. And I think it's something that is often played out, not just in Connecticut, but across the original 13 colonies. The other thing to think about when you're researching slavery is, let's think about the nature of the engagement of the area in which your organization sits. Was it a slave holding area or was it a slavery supporting area? This is important because, it depends on the story you're trying to tell. You might say to yourself, well, we want to tell a story about slavery in this town, but don't find a lot of supporting evidence for a good number of enslaved people or people who were enslaved in the town. Does that mean that a slavery related story can't be told? Not necessarily, because certainly Connecticut was extremely complicit in promoting slavery long after it was formally abolished in the state. So, just by way of example, the documents you see in front of you on the left, what you have is just a little page from the first federal US government census in 1790. And you can see, this is obviously a much later reprinted summary of it. You can see that on the left, it talks about town. And you can see certain towns had a lot more enslaved people than others, right? Fairfield had 203 at the time of this census who were counted, whereas Brookfield had 3. So if you're in a town like Brookfield, you might say, well, we don't really have a story to tell, except, and I don't know enough about Brookfield, so if there are Brookfield people here, please speak up. But what if a town like Brookfield had manufacturing that later supported providing clothing and hats and shoes and food to people enslaved in the South? So that's important to think about. You can, what's the story you're trying to tell, and that determines the records you're going to look for. A couple of other things before you really start digging into where does one find this research material is to think about who you're speaking about, and you might be speaking about more than one person. So we tend to think about primarily, for a good reason, by virtue of the numbers, enslavement in Connecticut as relating to people of African descent. And that is true, but it was a percentage of Native people who were also enslaved following the Pequot Wars. And then, of course, their children were enslaved if they were born into slavery. Often these individuals, the women or men too, would marry African-American enslaved people, and their children might be considered mulatto, they might be considered mixed. So this is important because you're not only looking for terminology that relates to African enslavement, and we're going to get into this, you're going to be looking into terminology that relates to Native enslavement and all the variations there. And of course, again, going by geography might really be give you the sense of what it is you're looking for based on your town and kind of who was there and what was going on. So when we talk about, important documents, some of these things are going to be obvious, but the census documents, 1790 again, 1800, all those census documents up to essentially 1848. And just as a refresher to remind everybody, the way that gradual abolition worked was if you were born 1784 or after, you were eligible to be emancipated at age 25. Later, the law changed to age 21. So what that means is that it was very possible to have people enslaved after the end or right up until abolition, full abolition in 1848, because they were born in 1783 or 1770, for example. So the census documents that we really want to look at for Connecticut are 1790, 1790, 1800, 1810, 1820, 30, 40. Because, and again, I don't remember if all of those census documents list enslaved people, but certainly 1790 does. So that's a good place to start. So these pictures are actually not only Fairfield, but the area that relates to Westport. And this is a really interesting point when you're talking about researching this, is because if you can find people, because, obviously they didn't go street by street, there weren't streets and they're not alphabetical. Sometimes there's no rhyme or reason to the way a census taker worked in those times. If you know for a fact certain people lived in your area, in your town, they sort of become person zero to work outwards from, to determine if the people around them physically are also in your town, because they did obviously stay within a geographic area. So I'll give you an example. Here we have Joseph Hyde, who had 4 enslaved people. The Hyde family, we know from other research we've done, is a prominent Westport family. So that tells us that all of these individuals, and these are names we recognize, were also Westport families. The last column is enslaved people. When you're doing this research, when you're looking at documents, it's important to know the research terms that you're going to be looking at and all the documents that I'm going to show you. Obviously, in census documents like 1790, there was a column for slave, but there's also other research terms you should be looking at. They were, and they're very different from terms that we would comfortably use today. And I think that's important to get your mind around, right? These are not terms that you would say that you would want to use, but they're important. And you can see them there. The most common terms you might see in documents are Negro, mulatto, Indian. Servant was often used, and it was less common to see Black or African in legal documents, but more in descriptive documents. So some of the documents that we used and that are, generally, I think many of you will have in your archives and certainly are available in state archives, commerce papers. So what do we mean by this? The papers that relate to the business of enslaved people. Enslaved people were property. Unfortunately and sadly, the documents that we often glean the most information from are documents relating to property, sale deeds, for example, tax records. So certainly during the colonial period and into the federal period as well, property was taxed, and therefore the human beings who were owned by other human beings were also property to be taxed. So that's a place to look. And then loan papers. So this is something that won't necessarily be in a clerk's office, a county clerk's office, for example, which is where these other property related documents would be, but in personal papers, and we'll talk about that. But what do I mean by loan papers? I mean quite literally the loan of one's enslaved person to another person for rent, making use of that person's skills, let's say they were a blacksmith, an apothecary, a shoemaker. Often owners would rent out a skilled enslaved person to another individual, get paid for their labor. And sometimes there were very quickly, briefly written contracts about this. In fact, sometimes you see this in store ledgers, and I'll show you that in a minute. As an aside, this was often how enslaved people were able to purchase themselves by their own freedom when they self-emancipated in that way, because sometimes owners would allow them to keep a small portion of this rental income for their own selves. Family papers, genealogies, and oral histories. So all oral histories are interesting only as a starting point. Obviously, as we all know, they need to be verified by primary sources. But here's an example in our archives. This is a type up of a handwritten memoir, essentially, of a descendant of the Jessup family. And he's talking about his grandfather, and he's talking about the enslaved people his grandfather owned, and goes into great detail about one individual named Tom. And he talks about him. And I say great detail, it's only a paragraph, but when we talk about the lives of enslaved people, to have this kind of character portrait of an individual is rare. So this is a good starting point. Now, with all these papers, family papers like this, how do you narrow it down? You think about that period where slavery was more likely to have occurred. Obviously, we're thinking about people of means. So in your own communities, think about those founding families, people who were wealthy, who could afford to buy and sell other human beings. And then it's just a matter of going through the personal papers, and if you're lucky and you have great finding aids and descriptions of what's in letters and so on, that is a great place to start. Revolutionary War service records were extremely useful to us because we were able to find individuals who related back to people that we knew in Westport were known slaveholders. So what this is a page from a ledger called the Book of Negroes. It's at the Nova Scotia archives in Canada. And this was essentially a book of people who were loyalists. They fought on the side of the British, and they departed with the British from the evacuation of New York after the Revolutionary War and went to Nova Scotia. So what we see on this particular page is, so this gentleman, Ishmael Coley, the rest of the page describes him as having been owned by Ebenezer Coley, who in fact was the man who owned the property upon which the Westport Museum sits. He went over to the British, he served, and he left. We're told that the Coley family descendants are a large and respected family in Nova Scotia even today. So that was quite interesting for us when we did this research. But this required us going out of our milieu, going to the Nova Scotia archives and finding this gentleman. The way this happened was essentially we simply contacted them and said, here are a list of people that oral history says lost men to the British during the war. Can you help us verify it? And that's how we went about that. Revolutionary War pension petitions by African-American men or their wives petitioning the government for their pension sometimes provides, not always, information that this person was formerly enslaved or became purchased their freedom, was emancipated at this time. Generally, again, as a matter of legal record, when it does appear to indicate that their owner didn't deserve their pension because they served in their stead versus they themselves. Also was useful for us were account day books, ledger books, and personal spike files. So these accounting documents can really be quite interesting. So the day books are the ledgers that are used day to day in a store or a mercantile, and they tend to have a lot more detail than formal ledger books, which later is the ledger that is nice and clean and tidy and only the barest information. So this one to the right at the bottom, this actually is a holding of the Fairfield Museum. Remember, as I said, Westport was part of Fairfield in Norwalk, and this relates to a store that was Judson's store, and this ledger is for a gentleman named Osborne. And what he says, and it's really interesting because he's writing almost in the first person to his debtor, right? To Osborne, who owes Judson money. And he says, you brought your Negro boy to my house which head, and we can't really make it out. But essentially, when you read it, you understand that this young man was injured on his head and his neck very badly. He remained at this house. He was cared for, and the homeowner, Judson, we presume is charging Osborne for the care. So this gave us a lot of really good information. These day books are a wealth of material when it relates to this topic for this very reason. They often also have credit accounts, not just for free people of color, but for enslaved people as well. Often enslaved people could hold credit accounts at local stores. They were referred to in the credit account, with a reference to their owner. And what you often see is that the goods are paid for by trade of labor, going back to this idea. Often owners would use the people they enslaved to pay back debts owed at a mercantile or to another person. And that appears in these day books as well. So that is another really great source. Personal spike files are quite literally the home, at home receipts and records that were, put on a nail to be saved. And the top right is, you see one here for Abigail Hyde. And we think that says, we're not really actually quite sure. It might be clothing, it might be cutting, but for Negro. And so this is a receipt that she had in her personal papers that we have in the museum. Church records, incredibly important. So this is a page, again, it's at the Fairfield Museum, but of the Greens Farms Congregational Church logbook. You can see from 1762. This is a list of deaths. And these are 3 listings underlined of enslaved children. You see a Negro child belonging to Captain Thomas Nash, belonging to the widow Morehouse Sturgis, belonging to a Gorham, Joseph Gorham. Congregational, particularly church records, logbooks are quite important. So certainly people who owned enslaved people did feel at times that they wanted to bring those individuals into the church for the civilizing aspect of Christianity. And you'll see births, records, baptisms, and deaths that will often list individuals and who own them. It's important here as well, particularly for the births, because the congregational churches, as we know, were the seat of government for a long time. And by listing the births here, even if a baptism didn't follow, it gave the individual, the owner, a written record of the fact that this child belonged to them because they were the offspring of a person that they enslaved. Cemeteries. Walking through a cemetery has always been useful to us. It continues to be useful to us. But again, you kind of have to think about it in the terms of the larger story. So very recently, we found this gentleman at a local cemetery. He died in 1901. He was 90 years old. That meant that he was born, about halfway through the period of gradual abolition. But more than that, it's the epitaph that gives us clues, a faithful servant. So knowing that servant was also a euphemism for an enslaved person, as well as the common meaning of a servant who was paid, that clued us in that we should check this man out. And in fact, he is African-American. We did find quite a bit about him. We still have, this is just recently that we found him. We still are not quite sure if he was born into slavery or not. But sometimes just kind of walking through a cemetery and taking note of epitaphs that say servant. Sometimes they will say slave, very rarely, and rarer still do they refer to people by their race. As I mentioned, real property records were really important to us because enslaved people were property. So emancipation papers, deeds, and probate inventories, the inventories being as they are today, used for taxation on the estate. All of these are actually usually in the land records of the county clerk's office, again, because of real property, and that's where you would look for them. And that includes emancipation papers too, because essentially you're releasing ownership, releasing the deed to your real property, so that you would find them in the county clerk's office, generally in the probate office or with the land records. Much harder to come by our insurance records, and this relates back to the idea that I mentioned of, are you in know your area? Are you in an area where we're talking about potential slave ownership or slavery supporting. So what these are just samples, they're hard to make out, of insurance policies sold by Connecticut insurers to Southern plantation owners for the insurance of their enslaved people. These are hard to come by. The insurance companies really don't want to make them available. Sometimes private collectors have them, but it can be a way to have a discussion in Connecticut or in a city or in a town that was slavery supporting well up to the Civil War versus having enslaved people. So the other thing that was useful to us, and I know I don't need to say this to anyone on this call, but the cross-referencing was so important because, you know, we're talking about such minute slivers of information. So what we did was we did this on our drive, our internal drive, but Google Drive works great for this as well. We created folders of individuals by the name of owners and put photographs, obviously, of every, or PDFs, document and information that we could get a hold of. And each one was referred to by year and where the document was housed. Our archives, Fairfield Museum, Norwalk Historical, the State Historical Society. We would highlight the names of enslaved people mentioned within these documents, you know, within a transcript of these documents. And we had a separate document that listed all yearly references so that we could, for example, Abigail Hyde's spike record with that little tiny receipt. Well, there was an Abigail who was the daughter of John Hyde, and his wife was Abigail too. And John Hyde, we know from other records, was prolific in buying and selling human beings. So this lets us know that this is very likely the same Abigail Hyde based on the year that was the daughter of John. So this helps us build a case, having a really clear sort of tree of information, because the information is so much in slivers and tiny bits and pieces, it could overwhelm you. And so the last thing I would say to you all is, in doing this work, the most valuable piece of research advice, or where to find it, and how we worked, was we just persisted, because it can be incredibly tedious. There's no doubt about that. It is, we're talking about information that I said can be a one-line reference in family papers that require just kind of wading through in places that you don't expect, like a store ledger, a small reference. And occasionally you do find references, it's not usual, but within family histories, a passing mention of a person. I would say, having been a researcher for a long time, and very specifically researching enslaved people, it is possibly among the most difficult things to research, just in terms of kind of weariness, finding those tiny needles in a haystack. But it is worth it. The material is there. You just kind of have to persist in finding it. So thank you very much for listening to my presentation, and I'll hand it back over to Emrys.
Great, thank you so much, Ramin. Before we split into breakout rooms, I just want to queue up a couple of quick questions for you. The book that you showed that was sort of a reprint of census information with the heads of families and information, could you pop a citation for that into the chat when you get a chance?
Absolutely, yeah. It's widely available from the Census Department. I will absolutely do that.
And we had a couple of questions about how to get access to records that were once held at the county level. Given that counties aren't so much a thing in Connecticut these days, where do you look for those? Is it at the former county seat? Do they end up in the towns? Where does that information end up?
Right, so that's the tricky part. Sometimes they wind up at local historical societies or history museums when these counties or towns have just kind of dumped them. Generally, they should be at the town level. They should be with the town clerk, is where they should be. But town clerks tend to offload material after about 100 years, 120 years. If you're lucky, they go up to the Connecticut State Library. A lot of them are at the Connecticut State Library. But check your local historical societies, and look, full disclosure, from our previous circumstance, the way our organization had been run, that can be really tricky. There's often not finding aids. It's often You have to get someone who's quite interested and will sit with you and say, like when I started this project, we didn't have finding aids. Our archives were rich, but they were a mess. And we had 2 volunteers working in one set of family papers who just got interested in what I was doing and just kept their eyes out. So, but start with your town, then check the Connecticut State Library, then check your local, historical societies.
Great, thanks so much, Ramin. What we're going to do now is split for about 5 or 10 minutes into breakout rooms. I will shuttle you off into those. And the question that I just want to pose to you guys to give you a chance to talk about is, how will you begin researching slavery in your locality? What are some of the places that you have ideas to start? And what are some of the stories you think you'd like to pursue in that vein? So I'd like to invite you to, unmute yourself, put on your video. When you get into your breakout room, just do a quick round robin and introduce yourself, and then address that question. We'll come back together in, let's say, about 7 minutes to hear from Melissa. I hope we had great conversations in your breakouts. I'd like to hand things over now to Melissa Houston from Keeler Tavern Museum, who's going to share with us her experiences around shifting interpretation in museum education programs. Melissa, take it away.
I just have to say first, before I share my screen, how much fun it is for me to see all of you. Like, I forget how much I miss seeing other museum people, and like Brian introduced himself and I'm just like, oh my gosh, hi. I just get so excited. I see Adrian's here. I see a lot of familiar faces. And it just makes me so happy. So in general, I talk a lot. So that was just me gushing for a moment. And I'll gush more in a second, but I'll share my screen first.
Gushing is welcome.
Oh, good. All right. So this presentation originally was I did it at CLHO a couple of years ago with Cheney. And I decided to keep a lot of the slides the same. I did change some. I'm gonna time myself, because like I said, I talk too much. But one of the reasons I kept this slide is in part because Cheney is a big part of how we were able to do what we've done with school programs. I can research to the nth degree, and I'm happy to. I love reading. I love reading books about how to teach, love reading books about history. But I think one of the big things that when you're looking to reinterpret your site, you need additional voices. You can't do it all yourself, and you really shouldn't do it all yourself. You should call on the experts. You should call on professors of African American history. You should call on interpreters like Cheney, so that you're having more voices at the table, so you make fewer mistakes. That's just being honest, because I am never going to say that I know all there is to know. I'm never going to say I'm the best teacher. I'm never going to say I use enslaved all the time instead of slave. We're all still learning. I've just been really intentional in probably the past 3 years in looking at slavery and how do we teach it, because it's a long process. So know that you'll never be finished. And I love that Ramin ended her presentation by saying, persist, because that's what it's going to take. I remember when I was a classroom teacher, my advising teacher told me, you're never going to have a good lesson plan for at least 5 years. You're going to teach it the first year, it's going to be terrible. You're going to teach it the second year, you have to change it. You're going to teach it the third year, you have to change it. Do it 5 years in a row, and then you'll have a good lesson. So it just takes time. So be patient with yourself. So this is just a brief history or kind of site history of Keeler Tavern. We are, like I said in our breakout session, this building's been around since about 1716. It has a long history. We have about 300 years of history here. Varied people have lived here. Lots of rich life experiences happened here, but we are also kind of a typical historic house where we have, the big hearth that people are used to looking at. We have all the utensils, some of us dress in costume. And so we have visitors of all ages come, public tours, as well as school programs. But what's unique about what we do is that we're really focused, our mission is really focused on telling the story of the residents who lived here. So we understand how slavery happened here in Ridgefield to a certain extent, and more broadly in Connecticut. But what we're really looking at the distinct lives that happened here. And so for us, just one document about someone who was enslaved or a person of color in this house is enough for us to say we need to tell that story. Because if our mission is to tell the story of the people who lived here and an enslaved person lived here, their story is just as valid as their enslavers. So this is kind of a rundown of the process that we've gone through. I'm going to fly through some of these slides because I just need to get to the end where I talk a little bit more about education stuff. But you'll notice that I say research, 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 research. A lot of books are out there now about the history of slavery in Connecticut. I know I have I literally have a pile of books sitting next to me because they're like my comfort blanket. But I also know that books are really important for all of us to learn from. And I know a lot of you probably have like the classic Generations of Captivity, which kind of goes through slavery as a whole, but does talk about slavery in New England. So understanding the differences between what happened at this site specifically, but also broadly in Connecticut, is kind of a first important step, and it develops as you're going along. But then another key thing is investigating if you have any institutional racism or interpretation bias that's been happening. And some of this can just be good intentions that were set, 20, 30 years ago. We don't write about history the same way as we did. We don't even write about history the same way we did 10 years ago or 5 years ago. So interpretation has to change. And that's not a bad thing. That's not pointing fingers at anybody who came before you. That's just understanding that we need to move through the stories. We need to develop ourselves and our understanding of the world around us, just as previous generations have. We just need to move the conversation forward. And then research for education programs, you need to understand what is going to be age appropriate and necessary according to experts in the field. So we've already mentioned Teaching Tolerance, which is a project from the Southern Poverty Law Center, and they have great standards and benchmarks for introducing slavery at all ages. I have kids in public school. I have a kindergartner, I have a third grader, and I have a fifth grader. And so I know that these conversations are hard to have with children, but I'm having them with my own children as kind of an experiment, half, because I need to be able to do it with other people's children. So you need to understand kind of what the baseline is for understanding is for all the different ages, and then connect. The big thing we've found is connecting with the experts and connecting with specific teachers. If you can find a specific teacher in your district or a teacher you've worked well in the past who's willing to give you their lesson plans, what the district has told them are their standards and benchmarks, then you can work alongside an educator, and that is extremely helpful in making sure that you are presenting information in a way that students can absorb it and that teachers can reinforce it. And the bottom, just in each step, always get other voices at the table, get more people of color in your conversations, get educators, get board members. You need a diversity of people, different positions in your institution. So this is where we started. So I started here at Keeler Tavern 3 years ago. And this document was shown to me, and it was kind of, well, it just takes your breath away. So Esther Kellogg becomes Esther Keeler when she marries Timothy Keeler, for whom Keeler Tavern is named. And Esther purchased about 14-month-old child named Betty. And this bill of sale is in our collection. So when this document was presented to me, we had a choice. And I said this in my presentation at CLHO a couple of years ago. We had a choice. And all of you have a choice. All of your historical societies have a choice. When you're presented with this information, your choice is either to say, wow, that's hard, that's terrible. Okay, we'll put it in the archival box, and when we have time, we'll get around to it. Or you have the choice to say, no, this is something that needs to be acted upon now. This is something that needs to be in our interpretation. This document is important enough. These people, Betty included, are important enough that this story should be told. And I mentioned at the presentation years ago that it's part of our white privilege to just put it back in the box and on the shelf, that we can choose not to tell the story. And one of the things that we have to be honest about is this document isn't just about Betty, but it's also about Esther. And Esther was an enslaver. And I am sitting in her kitchen, dressed in 18th century clothing. So if we're going to put pressure on, the Black people around us to help us understand slavery, there should be an equal amount of pressure on ourselves to understand what an enslaver is. Because slavery didn't just happen to Black people. Somebody was doing it, and it was white enslavers. So the story is two-sided, just like any other story. There's multiple points of view, and we can't deny one in order to tell the other. And one of the interesting things that, a sidebar, one of the interesting things that I heard on the Teaching Tolerance podcast was that when we're telling these stories about slavery, or when we're teaching the history of slavery, and we're constantly pointing the finger at enslaved Africans and never pointing the finger at the white enslavers, you're giving students of color almost shame triggers instead of empowering them. So part of what an educator, even today, a lot of schools have social emotional learning components in their curriculum. And so we need to be teaching to the whole person, and the whole history. I think that teaching the whole history helps students grow and develop empathy for each other, for differences, for the fact that somebody could be like Esther was a great businesswoman. She was a mother of many children. She probably was a wonderful community leader. She did a terrible thing. And that's going to be true of people of all times and places. So research first, action second. So understanding the histories that you have and the things that you may have. It was mentioned before that, I wrote it down, whether you are slave holding or slave supporting, there's tons. If you have a historic house and you ever talk about rum, that has to do with slavery. If you are a historic house and you talk about sugar, you have a cone sugar sitting in your display, that has to do with slavery. It's just whether or not you make the choice to say it. It's still there. It's just whether or not you take the time to teach that component of those trade goods. So the Betty Isaac purchase receipt is much clearer document than some of these objects, but there are plenty of opportunities in your collections to talk about slavery. And I think we have to be honest about the history of slavery in order to move forward from where we are today. And so any opportunity that you have, even if it's small, is important. When you're looking at how to use the information and what kind of lessons you can build, make sure that you're looking at other institutions, examples, either through social media or YouTube. There's tons of museums who are doing this right now, historic houses included, that are reinterpreting their histories to include more diverse stories, Native American histories, as well as African American histories, and look at what other people are doing and how they're doing it. There's lots of free trainings right now for teachers. So I signed up for one through the National Museum of the American Indian that was about how to teach Native American history. There's another free one through Colonial Williamsburg on how to teach American slavery. There are plenty of opportunities to learn. And then always make sure that you give credit to institutions when you're stealing their ideas or borrowing their ideas, improving on their ideas. And then make sure that you're looking at integrating those stories across your platforms. So putting it in your school programs is one thing, but is it also in your public tours? Is it also in your label copy? Do you talk about it on your website? Because those are all different ways that you can be telling the story. They're all slightly different avenues. They require a little bit different storytelling for which formats you're using, but there are plenty of places. If you don't feel comfortable straight out the gate teaching kids about how slavery happened at your site, maybe you start putting it out through Instagram and you just say, hey, we found this document, or we found this really interesting record, town record, and you can just start putting it in places. It doesn't have to be 100% everywhere all at once. And I think this was already talked about a little bit, but just making sure that you understand that just because what's written doesn't mean that it's the right story. So one of the families that lived here was Anna Marie Rezegui, and she lived alongside a woman named Phyllis Dubois, and Phyllis is Black and Anna Marie is white. And there was a play that was written about these two women as they lived through the 19th century together in this house, running this tavern. At that point in time, it was called the Rezegui Hotel. But they had very different experiences, talking about living through the mid-19th century, through the Civil War together in this house, and what their conversations might have been, and who these two women were. And there was a mention about gradual emancipation here in Connecticut. And Phyllis was born over in New York, and she was born about 1821. So when she came to the Rezegui household, she, to our understanding and according to the census, she was a freed Black woman, or child at that point in time. She was only a few years old when she came here, I think 9, somewhere around there. But you have to remember that she is growing up in this time where slavery did exist around her and in her world, you know. And so what was written about her, Abijah, who is Anna Marie Rezegui's father, writes a quote about how Phyllis was a wild child and how she was much harder than a colt to be broken. And you might think this is just a description of her behavior as a child, just being a wild and crazy child, but that language about breaking her like a colt is very specific to words that were used around enslaved people and having to break them in order to use them as effectively as you could because they were an economic piece of property. And so this phrase is probably less to do about Phyllis and more to do about the family's viewpoint of Phyllis living there. Even though she was a freed woman of color, if you're talking about breaking her like a colt and she isn't paid for many years that she worked here, there's obviously not an equal standing between these two women. So make sure that you're getting a larger picture of what's going on and not just taking that quote and throwing it out into the world. And when you're kind of looking at these stories, identify places within your institution. I kind of talked about institutional racism and understanding where it might appear within your programs or your papers or your brochures. Look at the language that's used. Sisters was the name of the play. Look at how you're referring to things. So when we first started using Betty Isaac in our programs, I had an AP group of students from the Bronx, and I had this receipt and I was dressed like this in this space, and this class in front of me was largely African American, and these are high school kids. And I was talking about the document and talking about the document, instead of saying she for Betty Isaac, I said it. And the students immediately reacted. And in my brain, it didn't register that I had said that. And I immediately apologized. And I looked at the students and I said, to be honest, sometimes I look at these documents and I think of the paper before I think of the person, right? So I'm talking about the document as an it. And instead of thinking of Betty Isaac as a 14-month-old infant, basically, we're talking about a toddler sold away from her family, brought into this family. And so you're going to make mistakes and your language is not going to be perfect. Identifying those points and reframing the story in your mind and reframing the words you're giving, practicing helps, and having consistent training, making sure that everyone knows what are the words we're using, and planning for those changes and those challenges to happen. So the come to Jesus moment is just recognizing the history for what it is, recognizing that right now, if somebody walked in and said, oh, are you Esther Keeler? I could just say yes and let it go, or, recognize that she's an enslaver and talk about that. Talk about the history of this house in a real way that takes up the whole story. Know what your institution's non-negotiables are. We did a training with Harriet Beecher Stowe Center, and they had certain non-negotiables for their training. One was, we will use enslaved versus slave. We will not move on that. We will say an enslaved blacksmith. We will say an enslaved man. We will say an enslaved child. We will give these people their personhood back instead of just saying slave. Know as an institution, what are those things that are non-negotiables that will be in your programs, that will be the words that you use. Recognize that this is a long road. It takes a lot of effort and time. Know, again, I feel like a broken record, you need more people at the table, more opinions, more expertise. Be okay with mistakes, and be okay if some of your docents just say, you know, I am just not comfortable with this. And that's okay. If your institution has decided that this is the direction you're going in, this is mission relevant, then that docent can do something else. Talking about institutions makes sure I find for anything, and I'm sure you all find it for anything. If you want to do something at your museum, you have to have institutional buy-in. That means the board has to know what you're doing. That means that your volunteers have to know what you're doing. Your staff has to know what you're doing, because you need support across the platform for changes to be long-term. The collections department needs to know that education programs are looking to build this story. So any document they come across, I had never heard spike files before. Makes sense in my brain now that I've heard it. But we found some small receipts like that. Last year, I think it was, our curator was going through some boxes and found a couple that referred to Negroes carding things in exchange for goods. So if the collections department knows this is something we're working towards, then we can all be in communication so we all know what's going on. Make sure that you're doing this with sincerity. This isn't just, oh, it's the new topic that's going on in the world today, so we should cover it. No, it's either you're doing it because you're being honest and sincere that this is your history and you're telling it, or find another time to do it. And if you put it up there or out there, don't be afraid that you've done that. You know, own it, stand by it. It's the truth. If it's you've researched it and you know it to be historical fact, then it's just the truth. And it can be a hard truth, but it's just the truth. And then integrate the stories instead of teaching them kind of as single units. Like we could offer here at Keeler one program that's just slavery in Connecticut, and that could be a separate program from colonial life. But instead, we make sure that the story of slavery is in colonial life, that the story of slavery is in our 19th century programs, so that it's not a standalone. It's not, for us, that's kind of a non-negotiable, that it's not a standalone, but that it's going to be across our programming. And recognize what's a limitation versus an excuse. So sometimes we have actual limitations. Documents might not exist. We might not have time and training right this moment, but that's a limitation you can overcome. So limitations might be you don't have staff who are trained or comfortable just yet. And that's a just yet, right? Or you might have staff or volunteers who aren't willing or able right now to talk about art history, or you might have a lack of institutional support. All these are really hard to overcome, but excuses are like, we don't know enough, so we just can't. There are so many resources out there. We don't have the funding. I know that one's really hard, but if it's your priority, as with all of our budgets, even your home budget, I know your budget for groceries. If that's your priority, you find that money for whatever it is you want to eat that week. So if it's a priority, you find the funding. It's going to be hard and uncomfortable, so that's not an excuse. That's just a reality. And the lack of institutional support and board support, to me, is probably an excuse. It will feel like a limitation for a time, but over time, the more you talk about it, the more people you bring in to talk to your board, whether it's historians or it's other museum people. I'm always on tap if you need a voice that's not you to talk about it. I find sometimes that's all it needs, is just a different voice. So speaking of different voices, here's Cheney. Cheney has developed a lot of programs with us in partnership with teachers. So that's where this has really worked for us, is having an interpreter, a consultant come in and really build programs alongside. This is one of our key teachers here in Ridgefield, alongside the teacher. So we know, here's the teacher's priorities, here's the recommendations from the consultants, here are the things that we actually can do that make sense, that are our strengths and educational needs. So some of your educational resources. You know, I do virtual field trips, so you think I should be able to do this without making a mistake. That's never the case. I had my computer run out of battery this week in the middle of a program. So it happens, even to the best of us, right? So educational resources. For reference, I would 100% recommend Teaching Tolerances Guidelines and Standards. I think they call them frameworks for teaching hard history. And if we have a hot minute, I can show you that website. Review your state and local curriculum standards. I had the unique experience this year. I have a 5th grader, and I looked up the local standard curriculum for his social studies curriculum, and it's the 19th century. They're going to talk about basically westward expansion, and there's mention of the Trail of Tears, there's mention of Native Americans, so like 1830s. Is there any mention of slavery? No. So my 5th grader is going to learn about the mid-19th century, and they're not going to teach anything about slavery. So I had to have a nice conversation with the teacher and with the curriculum director for the town I live in, and I have to start advocating for that because I believe in it, and it's ridiculous that you would not include it. But a lot of towns do include it, so find out what they are including. Read or attend workshops about teaching American slavery. One of my favorite books, and it's at the end of the PowerPoint too, and I think it's on the list, is literally Understanding and Teaching American Slavery. And this book goes chapter by chapter, kind of talking about how to talk about different segments of time, like the origins of slavery for different grades, kind of lays it out there if you're a book person versus a website person. Read books by African-American historians and authors. Read histories of slavery in New England and Connecticut. I found listening to podcasts while I'm cleaning has been a great way to multitask. And the Teaching Tolerance podcast, the first year that they put that out, it was really focused on African-Americans and Black slavery, but now they're moving on to stories of the Indigenous and Native American slavery. And this is my enormous stack of books that I carried with me today. I just thought you all should know how many comfort blankets I needed to talk to you about this. And one thing, if you're going to be teaching a certain grade, I would recommend that you read books written for that grade. So the Interested in the books, Chains and Ashes, those are written for 4th and 5th grade students. So if you read what students are reading at the grade level that they are reading, you get a sense of what you can teach and how it can be taught. One of my favorite new books is Everybody's Revolution, which is just underneath those, because it goes through not just what white soldiers were doing, but also African-American soldiers. There's a section on Jewish participation in the American Revolution. It goes through all different ethnicities, different loyalists and patriot, and how people from across a wide spectrum of people were in the American Revolution. I can put all of these on the resource list. I also find it's helpful if you look at like kids' guides books, be really careful, because like Kids' Guide to the American Revolution is usually a white perspective. So just make sure that you're being careful in the kinds of resources that you're tapping into, and make sure like a Kids' Guide to African American history I got at, I think it was the African Burial Ground in New York City. So just know the resources you're buying and who you're buying them from. And then when we put our programs out there, we usually pick a teacher that we know we work well with as our control group, so that we get good feedback, solid feedback from a teacher we already know how to work with. We ease into it. We do short stories or small pieces of information at first before we really build out a full storyline. Make sure you're always doing a postmortem on your programs. I round up some of our docents at the end of a program and get immediate feedback, but then make sure that you're checking in afterwards to reflect and adjust anything that needs to. Always continue researching, always continue training. We do staff training. Of course, hasn't been a while now that we've done staff training. COVID's made that harder, but I always provide resources to my docents. Every email that I send them, I usually do a PS, here's what I'm reading, or PS, here's what I'm watching. Just because we're all home doesn't mean we all can't be learning. And like I've said, this has been a long process. So we've been working with Cheney for, oh gosh, now it looks like, I guess, almost 4 years now. Working with her at first, it was just short. We just wanted to look at our 4th and 5th grade programs. Then it was talking to Harriet Beecher Stowe about institutional problems. Then it was the 19th century training. Then it was Native American training. Then it was the Civil War training. And then just constantly making this a part of your institutional training, your institutional conversations, dialogue with your docents. It becomes more familiar and less scary. And remember that ultimately what you're trying to do is just tell the whole story. I mean, it's not that complex. You're just telling the whole story. If a person of color lived at your site and you're telling their story, you're just telling the truth. You're bringing to light histories that have already existed, people who have already lived here, and their stories are just as valid as anyone else's. And I think, again, that one of our greatest opportunities as museums is to see that we're building empathy for people. A lot of times when I'm in costume, kids are like, oh, you look so weird, or aren't you uncomfortable, or doesn't that hurt, or can you bend over in your, I wear stays, not a corset. Lots of different questions. And when I can explain, they go, oh, that makes sense. You know, why are your petticoats made out of wool? Oh, well, it's water repellent and pretty fire resistant, so it makes me safer. The explanation about things gives people an understanding, whereas just not answering allows for misinterpretation, misunderstandings to just grow. So take the time to have the hard questions asked and answered. And I think it just builds also an appreciation of, you know, the diversity of human experience, and that we all walk through this life differently. We all make mistakes. We all have opportunities to be, I guess, pulled into our vices versus our virtues. And I think if we show people as real people that we make mistakes, that we do good things and bad things alongside each other, I think that helps students also develop an understanding of themselves, that I might do bad things, but I'm also going to do awesome things too. And I think those are really good lessons for young students. And when you look at the Teaching Tolerance website, this is a list of books, but you'll get, I can give you this as well in paper format. They do a really good job, especially in the kindergarten level, just teaching kids basic things like, what does it mean to be free? That's a lesson any kid can hear and understand and engage with. You know, what is agency? The ability to do things by your own decision. And do I have it? Those are kinds of concepts that can be taught through talking about slavery that are just as important as the story of slavery itself. So that's all I have on there. And oh my gosh, you guys, I talked forever. I even set a timer. And I saw the chat little thing dinging up, but I didn't click over because then I get totally distracted.
That's fine. It's mostly people sharing resources to kind of, you know, pile on to the great list of resources you've given us, Melissa. So thank you so much for that. I'd like to shoot us into breakout rooms for like 5 minutes real quick, just so you guys have a chance to kind of think about some of the ideas that Melissa has been sharing. And I think our guiding question for these will be, how will you reframe interpretation at your site to incorporate the history of slavery into what you're doing? So I'm going to quickly slot you all out. We'll come back for a quick regroup and ask any follow-up questions. So we'll see you back here in 5 minutes. Looks like we're all back here. Sorry for the shortness of that. I did want to make sure our presenters had time to share. And I hope you had a good conversation and an opportunity to share some of your ideas. I want to open things up to a brief Q&A, but I know that we've reached our sort of 2:30 time. So before we do that, in case there are folks who have to leave, I just want to take a moment to offer an enthusiastic thanks to our board president, Elizabeth Rose, for organizing this workshop, to Dan Broyld for giving us that framing and for giving us a way to start thinking about slavery in Connecticut, and especially to Ramin and Melissa for sharing the incredible resources with really practical guides for how to begin doing this work at your own site. So let's have a quick thank you to Ramin and Melissa, especially for what they have provided us today. I want to open things up. If Ramin and Melissa, if you're able to, are you able to stick around for a few minutes to address some questions? Great. I want to open things up to a more general conversation. If you want to speak up, just put it in the chat and unmute yourself and I can call on you. I just wanted to go through, I know we had a few questions that had come up earlier that I wanted to pose to our presenters. And if you have any others, please throw them in the chat and Joni and I can queue them up. Ramin, there had been a question that came in from someone earlier about what was the fate of children of those in that period where people had the chance to be emancipated at 21 or 25. What was the fate of their children if they had children before that time?
Right. So, well, you have to think about it as, again, you think about enslaved people as property, and each piece of property was dealt with individually as that piece of property. So to make it clear, although an unpleasant analogy, imagine if you owned a house, it is not tied to another house you might own or another house you might own, even if they're all in the same 3 acres of land. Let's say they were all separate deeds. So if an enslaved person reached the age of majority, 21, 25, later 21, and had a child, the child remained the property of their owner, the person who enslaved them, until that child reached the age of majority. Because each individual enslaved person had their own, let's call it their own deed. The owner had their own deed to each individual person. So what you'll sometimes see in wills, very specifically, you'll see it actually rather often, is directions that an enslaved person and her child, it's always a mother and a child, remain together. I give my enslaved woman, Kate, and her child, Bet, to my daughter, Abigail High, and so on. And it has to be written out that way because otherwise you're talking about two separate pieces of property.
Can I add something here as well?
Yeah.
So the reason why they set these time limits is because that's a way to pay for the property. You can't take property in the United States without paying for it. You can try it, go to Walmart and pick up some property that you don't own, right? And so in other words, in order to pay for this, the state didn't want to go house to house and be like, here, how much are they worth, right here? And so what they did is set these kind of arbitrary, ages or whatever to act as almost like a reparation for the owner, which is very interesting, instead of the enslaved, right?
Thanks, Dan. That's a great point. I don't know if we have any other questions. I had a couple of things that I wanted to kind of underline in listening to these presentations that I think really came out of this for me. And I think that, all of you have really underlined the importance of not balkanizing this history, right? Not saying we're going to cover it in this, in like one exhibit or a one-off thing, that this is something that we really need to integrate throughout the way we approach telling the stories at our sites. And so it's really kind of a shift in mindset and thinking about how the histories of enslavement are woven through the economic and social systems in New England and in Connecticut in particular, whether that's directly through enslavement or through these other economic relationships, being involved in a trade that is connected to places where there are still enslaved people, for instance, the South or the Caribbean. And then also thinking a lot about power relationships, and about how those inflect the archive and inform the way that you need to do research and the way that you read the sources. Really thinking about, I was thinking about this when Melissa was speaking, how important it is to think about who is writing the document that you're reading, who's creating it, and how to kind of read against the grain to understand the perspective of enslaved people or whoever is sort of the lesser in that power relationship. And how you can through, I think, Ramin demonstrated this really nicely, how you can through looking at a lot of different kinds of sources help to dig out that story and uncover it, even if it's not the thing that you see just on the surface, reading that document, right off the bat at first blush, how it appears. So those are a couple of things that really, I think, came out to me in your presentations. And I just want to thank you for making those points.
Emerus, might I say something quickly?
Absolutely. Dennis,
Yeah.
do you want to introduce yourself? We'll be seeing from
So
Dennis
I'm
next week.
going to be one of the speakers next week. So certainly I would love to have all of you there next week. And secondly, sitting back today, I think I was overwhelmed by the great work that was done in Westport and Ridgefield and the details and putting as many of the pieces together that you have right now to do the project. And I'm feeling that the theme for next week is, and there's a little something you can do too. So in other words, you can get started without doing a 3 or 4 year evaluation research project to get started. And I think that's going to be the lesson that, and I don't want to speak too much for Elizabeth and Tracy, but I think that's a lesson that we're going to have. You can do something. Don't let the enormity of trying to interpret around slavery keep you from interpreting around slavery. Do something, say one name, tell one story, show one document. And that, I think, opens up. It's like opening the faucet. It comes out as a drip and then it comes out, I'm sure Ramin saying like a hose. Sometimes it comes out like a hose, the information you can have. But that's what I was so inspired by what was done today, but it also, in a sense, inspires me also to say we can do one thing, and that one thing can begin to make the difference and begin to change the story you're telling. So thank you for Elizabeth and Emerus for putting this together, or for Beth and Emerus, and always nice to see you again, Dan. It's my pleasure. And I stole some of your slides, and I will try to give you credit from time to time. So, thank you.
Borrowing, right? Great. Well, thank you all. I'll just, before we leave today, I just want to invite you all to register give you a preview of what's happening and this time slot next week. I hope you'll register for the session. I popped the link in the chat. But we'll have Dennis Culleton, as well as Elizabeth Devine and Tracy Wilson talking about the Witness Stones project and how it's worked in the community of West Hartford. And we'll also have Elizabeth Norman from Connecticut Explored talking about developing materials for classrooms, thinking about, in particular, the book she wrote called Venture Smith's Colonial Connecticut, working with Venture Smith's narrative as well. We'll do more breakouts. We'll have more opportunity to think about how to implement these sorts of things at our sites. So I'd like to invite you to join us for that next week. And in the meantime, thanks again to all of our presenters, to Beth, to Dan, to Joni for helping me here today, and to Ramin and Melissa. And I hope to see you all next week. Have a wonderful weekend.
Thank you.